What makes
This is Blacklisted. I'm Chris Hill. Welcome to the show. So John Yorke, welcome to Blacklisted.
Thank you for having me.
I think our paths crossed back in 2007 when you were controller of BBC Drama. I was a lowly sort of master's student at the National Film and Television School, and we came in and we pitched you some TV shows. And I think I was paired up with a producer called Jonathan Loseley, who now is head of scripted originals at Amazon MGM over there in London. And
Wow.
we pitched you a show about roadies. And I think then Cameron Crowe went on to make that incredible show at HBO. So I think he was a much better person to do that TV show.
Well, maybe, but was I nice about it?
You were nice at the time, actually. You were encouraging. I think Jonathan and I thought we should have come back to you with the project. But then again, later on, I worked on a show called Skins, which is quite popular in the UK.
Yeah.
I was on season 4 of that show, and you were then managing director, I think, of Company Pictures, the firm that produced that show.
Yes.
But less about me. Let's go back to 2005 when you set up the BBC Studios Writers Academy, because one thing I found coming out of film school was that there was kind of short shrift given to story structure in the sort of instruction at the school. And I wonder if that was something that you found with folks coming out of these institutions, like maybe the Royal Court with playwrights and places like the National Film School, that you were finding they weren't necessarily given the skills, at least in story structure, in the UK as maybe the US UCLAs or USCs in the States were training their students.
I think that's right, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. The first one is the British writing establishment. Certainly, when I joined as a young script editor, which is in the sort of 90s, were very sceptical about Robert McKee and Sid Field and the like, and they sort of looked down on it as formulaic. And so there was still a sense of like, we are artists, we don't do popular stuff, we do stuff that, scours our souls. And I think that was part of it. In addition to that, the National Film and Television School, bless it, and I work for them all the time and they're lovely. Back then, they were very, very sceptical about television.
Very distinguished lines. There was a television course and then there was kind of the film department, as it were.
Yeah. But they sort of looked down as telly as somewhere you went if you hadn't succeeded in film. And so I think that was part of it. The Royal Court was slightly sniffy, likewise, in the theatre, because they looked on the BBC in particular as a kind of bourgeois, centrist establishment that really didn't conform to their radical, agenda. ITV was getting their contempt. Yeah,
putting people off their breakfast was not the aim of the game of the BBC in their eyes, I guess.
No, exactly that. And so I think that combination of things meant that there was, Britain was quite behind all of that stuff. America seemed to just accept much more readily the idea that there was a shape to stories and you should know it. And so they were way more advanced than we were. I mean, I think some of the British scepticism was justified, to be honest, but it meant that largely they were behind the curve, I think.
Yeah. Well, the main reason we're talking today is to talk about your fantastic book, Into the Woods, which came out after your experience, I think, of working with countless writers through the BBC, through the Academy, and as an executive. And I have my trusty copy here. I brought it out from the bookshelf, Into the Woods.
Bless you. Thank you.
I saw on Amazon, actually, that I bought it back in May 2013. So it's been sort of reverberating for over 10 years in my mind. But it even has the old subtitle of 5-Act Journey into Story.
I was just going to say, that's an original.
I think there's the more sort of user-friendly title or subtitle now of how stories work and why we tell them.
They changed it quite quickly. I mean, they didn't tell me they were going to change it, but I think it was the right thing to do, because I think 5 acts, it sounded like yet another gimmick from another story guru, you know.
Yes. Yeah, because the main idea in it that still sort of lingers for me is that this idea that we're all familiar with act structure, that, as you said before, it's not something that was invented by Sedfield or Blake Schneider or even Aristotle, that essentially act structure sort of mimics the way that our brains assimilate knowledge, as you've said. So maybe let's talk about that.
Sure. I mean, I think story structure mimics the way our brains make sense of the world, which is why you will find similar structures, wherever you look in whatever culture in the world. Albeit with sort of cosmetic differences, if you like, for want of a better term. Storytelling is ubiquitous. It's what differentiates us from animals, and it's why we are one of the main reasons why we are so successful as a group, because we have the power of
sharing information.
Our ability to share information, but also to motivate people through the abstract concepts of heaven and hell.
Okay.
It's an extraordinary power that chimpanzees just don't have, and they're next on the chain.
To imagine those concepts, even to sort of imagine the concept of heaven and hell.
They can't, and I think that's why. I mean, it's not an original thought. Yuval Noah Harari sort of points out in *Sapiens* that why can chimps not organize themselves in groups of more than, I think it's 12 from memory, whereas Hitler could persuade 3.5 million people to join him in the invasion of Russia in 1944. And that's just a really clear and stark illustration of its power. So that story structure shape is ubiquitous and just really mimics the fact that it comes from basic perception. I exist, I observe, I change. That's 3 acts. Simple, but that's it. Act structure evolves from that as a way of structuring a story in order to make it comfortable for an audience to participate. Once 5-act structure was the norm, and the reason for that was going all the way back to Horace. And the reason for that was the plays were long, they were structured to give regular breaks because you can only concentrate for so long and allow the audience to stretch their legs and blah, blah. And you see this really particularly with Shakespeare, where by the time you get to the Globe Theatre, the audiences are drinking a lot, they're standing up, and sometimes for hours. If you're a producer, it just makes sense. How are we going to make it comfortable for them? And so you build in.
How long does the bladder last, I guess, as well? Yeah.
It's related to, I love the fact it is related to the capacity of the human bladder and act. But then when you get to the last 10 or so plays of Shakespeare, the late plays, you see that the act structure becomes even more regularized. And he starts writing himself. The early act structures were imposed by others.
Right.
And what's happened then is they've moved indoors. They've discovered how to light inside. And that's done by using candles and putting them on candelabras and raising them up to the ceiling. And so what happens is each act becomes the length of a candle.
Wow. Yeah.
So you see this amazing technological breakthrough that gives you act structure, 5-act structure. It was utterly ubiquitous until really the age of film and theatre, and then film, in the 19th, 20th century came along and changed that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I heard a story about the compact disc, and when it was invented in terms of its length, it was sort of described as, or it had to fit maybe one of Beethoven's symphonies. It was the tech is dictated by the art, and the art's dictated by the tech. It's
I think that's absolutely right. Technology continually changes, and then you sort of mash up story structure to fit the technology, and podcasting would be the latest iteration of that. But if you go back to the novel, the first novel in the UK was Robinson Crusoe, which was 1719. It's a relatively new form, and you see how fiction shapes itself around that. So, the underlying story shape, I think, never changes, not even in TikTok, to be honest. But what changes is the way it's passed for the technology.
Yes,
and that's what's so extraordinary about it.
Yeah, I think maybe people would like to understand the difference between the sort of traditional 3-act structure in, say, screenwriting, this kind of idea, as you say, of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, beginning, middle, and end. And how do you then sort of impose a 5-act structure onto 3 acts? Because I feel like they are not differentiated. They're sort of imposed on top of each other, I think, in the book.
Yeah.
It's a sense of creating more opportunities to not get lost in the woods, essentially, of having these waypoints in the story.
Yeah, okay. I'll tell you a story if I may. It may be too long, so feel free to cut it. But
No, do.
This all came about. I was head of drama at Channel 4. I was making a film with Paul Greengrass before he did the Bourne films, and he was a brilliant man. I mean, just insanely passionate. And
was that Bloody Sunday? Was that
Omar? It was a film about the Omar bombing,
okay.
which was just after, I think.
Okay.
He was also quite scary, but because he was so passionate. And we were making this film, and we started filming, and it was going quite well, but there were a few concerns and niggles. And he rang me up one day. He said, John, we've got no 5th act. And I paused, and then I said, you're right. And he said, well, let me fix it. And I said, sure. And so we gave a small amount of money so he could fix it. But what I was thinking was like, oh my God, I don't know what an act is. So I'm just going to nod.
Right.
And that really sort of began my journey into trying to, oh God, and then realizing, this act structure thing was actually quite useful and quite important.
So he was a documentarian. He had a sort of understanding of structure even as a documentarian, and I think documentaries do have that, right? Yeah.
I think in many ways they have a better understanding.
Yeah.
Because they have to,
form it into some structure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly that. And so they're so used to taking raw material and shaping it in a way that is persuasive, and he was particularly brilliant at that. He was an extraordinary documentary maker before he became a great filmmaker. And so I was teaching this stuff and sort of digging into it and slowly realizing that 5 acts and 3 acts were very similar, and they were products of their period, but if you looked at story structure through the prism of 5 acts, it revealed much more about what was going on within act structure, and particularly in that middle act. So technically, 3-act structure, you stick 2 more act breaks in, you have 5 acts, and that's all it is. But it tends to work better for longer works because, as Aristotle pointed out, the longer your duration of your work, the more act breaks are required. Basically, you're just looking for reversals. You're looking for reversals every 20 odd minutes, because otherwise the audience will get bored. But by doing that, it makes it easier to look at story structure and go, oh my God, these are symmetrical. It's looking for symmetry. That was the first realization, is stories always seek a symmetrical shape, to a crazy degree. But
with the midpoint being this almost reflective symmetry, right? The midpoint creating this.
Yeah. But that was where I sort of really got into realizing how important the midpoint was in all of these. What isn't in Robert McKee? It's not in Sid Field. It's not in any of those books at all.
But I've heard it. We sort of assume it was in Sid Field, but he doesn't mention it at all in the first book I've heard recently.
No, I think he gets around to touching on it later, and he talks about pinch points, which are really act breaks, to be honest.
Sure.
I mean, Robert McKee embarrassingly fails to go anywhere near it at all, which I think is one of the major flaws in that book.
Story, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of it, frankly, is just wrong. A lot of it is very useful, but a lot of it is wrong because it's absolutely central, because it's from that middle everything stems. It is the heart of the story. It's the lesson embodied within the story that the character must learn, and it's the point where everything changes. And if you look at, I do this with students all the time. They're all writing it without realizing they're writing it. So even if you don't know about it, you'll do it anyway. And I think that tells you a lot about the human brain just forms stories according to this shape. And some people are more attuned to it than others. And the longer you've been doing it, the better you get. But fundamentally, even my son will put one in, and he's 8.
Yes, no, sure.
And I've
said that before. son is also 8, and I do feel there's this innate sense of beginning, middle, and end. There is that sense of story structure that's innate. But no, I have an actual background in mathematics. I studied it as undergrad. And so the other concept that I found interesting, apart from the symmetry that you talk about, and we can go back to psychological change and the importance of that, but just the idea of fractals, the idea of a fractal being this thing that expresses self-symmetry or self-similarity.
Yeah.
And a fractal being sort of something that looks the same at different scales, and how acts sort of mirror sequences, mirrors scenes.
Absolutely.
When did you sort of come upon that idea? Because that's quite a sort of abstract mathematical idea that's then imposed on this kind of narrative idea.
I mean, that was a real breakthrough moment. I remember banging the table and going, "Oh my God, of course, everything is fractal." It came actually out of I was reading a lot of the art critic Robert Hughes at the time. He'd written a really important book in contemporary art history called The Shock of the New. And he's a wonderful writer. I mean, just his prose sings off the page. It's just gorgeous stuff. And he was talking about the fractal structure in Jackson Pollock. He was talking about drip paintings in Pollock, and he's explaining they were fractal. And then I sort of then looked that up.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's magnifications of the same unit endlessly, and that's they what give Pollock that sense of both chaos and order at the same time, which is the tension that underpins his work.
Right.
And as soon as I read that, I went, "Oh my God!" And then you go and look at an act of any film, and you will see within the first act the inciting incident, the midpoint, the crisis point. Yeah, I mean, Star Wars being an obvious example. Yeah, because you always go to the obvious ones first.
Yeah.
And then you look at a series, and then you go, of course, there's a series midpoint, and there's a series inciting incident, which is always the end of the first episode. There's always a series crisis, which is always the end of the penultimate episode, of the series, where David Simon always kills someone. It's like intrinsic. It's where E.T. dies.
Yeah.
But I think it was that realization that was kind of like, and then it was around then that the midpoint became, oh, this is actually really fascinating and useful if you know it, I think. Basically, I'd started teaching young writers, and for the first year or two, I was literally cribbing Field and McKee and Blake Snyder. And then, because I was running a big department, I had this extraordinary laboratory where I could train writers and then road test everything. And so over 4 or 5 years, everything I taught was stress tested. And you go, oh my God, that's not true. You're wrong about that. And so over time, it evolved. But it took
so there was a trial and error
in
these concepts from story that were sort of falsified by practical experience.
Yeah, listen, I don't want to be unfair on Robert McKee because, he's incredibly important. But I remember reading in Story, he's arguing that, in ordinary people, Robert Redford's Ordinary People.
Yeah, great movie,
wonderful movie. That the inciting incident was when Mary Tyler Moore throws her French toast down the sink. And I read that and I said, that is just rubbish. I know that's rubbish. It's not true. But I couldn't prove why it wasn't true. So I was slightly driven by this slightly mad pathological attempt.
Well, she's a secondary character. She's not even the main character in the movie, right?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And so I thought, well, if he's wrong about that, then he's probably wrong about other stuff. And I think that sort of led me. I mean, again, it's like, with all due respect. But what was really interesting, so around this time, I thought I need some literary kudos here. So I went to talk to a professor of English literature at the University of London, because I said, I need some professional input to this. And I said to him, what do you think of Robert McKee and this stuff? And he said, oh, that stuff. He said, yeah, well, we'd fail it. He said, if you handed it in as a dissertation, we'd fail it. And I was quite shocked by that. I said, well, why? And he said, because there's no proof. He said, never trust a book.
The why, right.
Yeah, we'd never trust a book without footnotes and an index. He said, because it's really no better than conspiracy theorizing.
Yeah, it's almost like
Uh,
religious text, right? It's
yeah, you
yeah.
have to prove it. And I go, of course, you have to prove it. And so you have to bring scientific rigor to everything they say. Yeah, and that applies even more so with the hero's journey and the sort of nonsense you read about that the whole time. You realize the more you look at it, the hero's journey isn't, no one built a theory of story structure on men wielding swords and entering dark caves. It's a metaphor for the way story structure works. That's what it is. And if you don't approach it that way round, it's frankly ludicrous. Even though people
No, that
copy it and it will work, it's still ludicrous. It's a metaphor.
exactly. No, that's what I particularly like about this book is the scientific almost rigor of it. That there is the kind of answering the question of why.
Mm.
It's not rules without context.
Well, thank you. That seemed really important to, because of course that would also differentiate any book and also make the teaching better because you have to keep coming back to why.
Yeah.
Why
No,
does story
exactly.
structure exist? Why does act structure exist? Absolutely.
Yeah. And I heard an apocryphal story of you talking with Jed Mercurio, who's a fantastic writer, and a series called Bones that I've really enjoyed. That I don't think got as much attention or love at the time. Right? It kind of was under the radar. Bodies. Yeah, it was slightly under the radar at the time, but fantastic show. And I think he said to you that all story is structure, and he sort of almost put sort of dialogue and those other elements of screenwriting as secondary or tertiary. Yeah. Was that part of the reason that you sort of lent into structure in terms of the Academy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was doing Bodies with Jed, who was then pre-line of duty and sort of working on the fringes of television at that point. And he was just brilliant. He was just an incredibly intelligent man. He's a trained pilot who's also a trained doctor, and also he's a magnificent writer. His brain is just like huge, and he just works everything out scientifically. And so I was just starting to thinking, oh my God, I need to teach this stuff because I need to find new writers. And so I went to him a lot, and he was like, in his own slightly tetchy way, he's kind of like incredibly helpful. And just said, no, that's not true. That's not true. This is true. But he said, everything is structured, John. It's like, it's all about this. The dialogue is absolutely secondary. He said, what matters is what characters do, what that reveals about them, and where you place that information. And the dialogue is what you add once you've written the structure. The dialogue is the icing. And if you don't do that, then you're making a big mistake. You're writing theatre. Because the story must be carried by action and the dialogue is the dressing on the top. And it was a kind of brilliant, oh my God moment, of course, which I think is still absolutely right.
Yeah, that's something I struggle with sometimes in screenplays is the passivity of the lead character. And how do you sort of manage for that? If you're working with writers, how do you sort of encourage a writer to make their lead character less passive?
Normally by being quite grumpy with them and saying, like, you've got a passive protagonist, it's not going to work.
Is it really about giving them choices?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think you just have to remind them that, you can get away with passive protagonists in novels because the author's voice will do the work for you. They're the active ingredient. But in drama, it is entirely built around, a protagonist seeks a solution to a problem. And so if you just frame it like that, then, that forces the protagonist to be active. But it is still striking how many scripts I get, particularly from younger writers, where the story is, terrible things happen to someone for 2 hours.
Okay.
I mean, and that's very soapy and profoundly depressing to watch and boring as well.
Right.
So, the way I like to think of it is, if you boil down story structure, but partly to its anthropological roots, all a story is a question followed by an answer. So the question is the inciting incident, the answer is the story. And so you just have to remind people that it's not you answering the question, it's the protagonist. The protagonist is answered the question posed. And so they have to seek the answer. And that seems to work.
Okay, no, that's fantastic. We spoke to another writer on here called Tom Vaughan, who also has like an 8-sequence approach to structure. But his definition of story is that it's the transformational change of a human being. I would probably go one step further and say that you could sort of extend the human being to, you know, any kind of lead character. You know, in Avatar, it's a half Na'vi, half human. But I think it's fundamentally on track with what you're saying, in that psychological change is the story and the midpoint is the kind of shifting of that. So how do you track that internal journey with those external beats? How do you...
Well, I mean, basically a story is, you know, a story has a character who learns something. Or if they don't learn, we learn from where they are at the beginning and where they are at the end. So they're units of knowledge, fundamentally. Yeah, that's what a story is, I think. You know, which I don't think that contradicts Tom. I think it probably may add to it slightly. And you know, if you look at classic story shape, I mean, again, very archetypal. Is, you know, the character is flawed at the beginning. They know nothing. So take the Shawshank Redemption, for example. Tim Robbins' character is deeply flawed because he's unable to stand up for himself, and he's meek and passive fundamentally, and he goes with the flow. The inciting incident is like he's thrown into prison, this abusive prison system, and so he has to go on a journey to overcome his flaw, and so what he's got to learn is to stand up for himself and find autonomy, and through that will gain freedom. So the problem is presented to him. Okay, if I then my life is going to be shit. Is presented to him at the inciting incident. Forgive my language. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And the midpoint is where he discovers the solution to that. So if you look at the film, it's where he locks himself into the governor's office.
The Mozart scene.
Yeah, plays Mozart.
Yeah.
It's just one big scene saying freedom, you know.
Right.
And so you discover the solution in the middle. And then the second half of the story archetypally is you stress test that point. Is that true? Is that right? What are the consequences of this? Do I like it? Do I not like it? And then you get to the crisis point, you know, which in his case is his alibi being assassinated by the guard, I think, from memory. And you know, what are the worst possible consequences of this knowledge? And if you are willing to accept those, then you embrace change, freedom, you escape, and you are healed. You know, you'll see exactly the same thing in Thelma and Louise. You have to, I mean, I'm simplifying massively, but just take Thelma character, the Gina Davis character. At the beginning, she is living under the yoke of a Darren the patriarchal, you know, emblem of patriarchal society. Exactly halfway through, after she makes love with Brad Pitt and discovers power within her that she didn't know she had, and maybe, oh my God, and it's like a drug coursing through her, and then she goes and robs the store because Brad Pitt has stolen their money. It's like, wow, this is amazing. And then you play the downside, the negative, like, oh, maybe it's not as good. Shit, I'm being chased by the police, and now, you know, we're going to go to jail. Like, you know, so you explore that, and then, no, I will accept this. The last act is where you embrace the lesson you encountered, if not fully understood in the middle. And that absolutely mirrors the way humans make sense of the world. You know, like it's the direct correlative is actually with the scientific method. You know, which is, I have a problem, I develop a hypothesis, I test that hypothesis to destruction, and then I change. And it is bizarre just how accurately that maps onto story structure.
Yeah, the antithesis being that sort of stress testing, that you're sort of testing your thesis.
Yeah, but you know, you exist as thesis, and you're thrown down a rabbit hole into a world that is absolutely opposite to everything you've resembled. It's always directly opposite. And in that world, you encounter the lessons that have been missing, and you try and sort the bad from the good, until you slowly work out what is you're going to have to adopt in order to defeat the antagonist, which is part of your long-term goal.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I sound a bit mad, don't I? But
no, I love the Alice in Wonderland references. It's fantastic.
Well, I mean, it's the best metaphor for story structures. They just toss them down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, And the upside down world of that, the kind of...
Yeah, absolutely.
This other idea of symmetry, so we have this midpoint that has this reflective symmetry, which then I guess the extension of that is that maybe the end of the first act sort of mirrors the end of the second act, that there is this kind of like reflective distance from the midpoint. Is that something that you sort of talk about in the book of the end of the first act having some significance on the end of the second act?
Well, what you have is that what the technical term, which I'm sure you know, is chiasmus. Yeah, well, chiasmus is basically you start with bookends.
Okay.
So the example I always use is, it's a really old one, but it's the Fabulous Baker Boys, where at the beginning, it's a really old film, but Jeff Bridges.
I like it. Yeah.
It's a great film. It's a lovely film, and he's with a girl, and the girl says to him, "Will I see you again?" He just says no. And at the end, he's with Michelle Pfeiffer, and he asks her, "Will I see you again?" And she says, "Maybe." So they're kind of reflective mirrors. But if you look at that film and you look at every scene going in towards the midpoint, you will find a mirror, and it's deeply disturbing.
Right,
if you look at if you want to do it, and I advise you not to because there are better ways of spending your time. If you take all the Harry Potter books, which I think there are 7, and you fold them in half, the level of mirroring is extraordinary and suggests, unless it was all part of a conscious design, and I have no way of knowing that actually the human brain is performing this act of chiasmus as well. We're sending out a radar signal, and it's coming back, and before and after, it hits its object, comes back. Story structure is very like that, I think.
Right.
And so the inciting incident, which is in 3-act structure, is the end of the first act roughly, and the crisis point, which is the end of the second act, they are clearly connected to each other, because the latter is the worst possible consequences of the decision you take at the former.
Yes. Okay. And so
that connection works all the way through.
So Blake Snyder only is limited to this kind of idea of the opening image and the closing image. So he's kind of like, he's sort of onto something there. But you're saying that every single scene as you go towards the middle is kind of having that reflective symmetry of the same idea of
What I'm saying is, I'm quite fond of Blake Snyder. I think it's a fun book.
Me too.
I think the thesis antithesis thing is absolutely right, and he's right about more. I find giving page page
25 for the end of Act 1. Yeah,
you need to specify your font size if you're going to do that. Frankly, it's a bit silly. But the opening closing image is absolutely right. But what I'm saying is the Platonic ideal of story is absolute mirroring all the way through. I don't think everybody achieves that.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot of work to do that consciously. I think what's striking with a lot of great writers, who've been writing for years, is they do it unconsciously. Because it's just striking how often you observe it, and with all allowances for confirmation bias when you're looking, it's there a lot, and is really, it's not. It can't be an accident that it's there so often. But chiasmus is a great thing to look at. If you look at any James Cameron film, the mirroring is really striking. But the example I use quite a lot, and I don't know if it's a thing where you are, but the Gruffalo, the kids' book.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, we have all the Julia Donaldson books here for my son. Yeah.
That's the Gruffalo is in a way the Platonic ideal of storytelling.
Right.
It's like the monsters in the middle.
Yeah.
And it's totally
that's a fantastic example. Everyone should go out and buy that book.
They should. It's a fantastic book.
Yeah, I'm just curious how I can understand how these ideas apply to a feature film and a limited series. If a writer is working on a show that's a returnable series or these kind of 6-episode shows in the UK, it seems a lot harder to apply these ideas to something that is kind of returnable and coming back. So how does it apply to sort of long-running television? Does it apply as much, or?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, the answer is it should apply, but it's why almost all TV series at some point start to feel
Run out
like
of
they're letting
steam.
you down. Yeah,
Okay.
jump the shark is the old phrase, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you look at the closest you get to perfection is something like Breaking Bad in terms of structure, because Vince Gilligan very clearly knew the ending before he started. And he said, there will never be more than 5 seasons. May not get there, but if I get there, that will be it.
It's the Mr. Chips to Scarface, that kind of transition.
Exactly that. And I think, you can't really write a perfect narrative work until you know the ending. Buster Keaton used to say, you work out the beginning, then you work out the ending, and once you've got those two, the middle takes care of itself. And and it's a lovely illustration of that point. But a lot of drama, commissioned on the first script and a vague synopsis of what goes on ahead, but very few people. I mean, the famous example of Lost, which is a embarrassing ending. Game of Thrones, even worse. Everything is about the ending. Everything leading to the ending is about the ending. But if you don't know what it is, then you will feel a sense of disappointment at some point. And I think
it makes you question the journey that you've taken, right? It does make you question. It doesn't matter how much fun you had on the ride. It sort of makes you sort of second guess the experience you've had if the ending's not there.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that's why commissioning systems really need to acknowledge, if you want to improve TV, the first thing you do is, you need to commission the end around the same time.
Or sign off on that.
Or sign off on it and work out that there is a clear narrative structure that will lead to
this piece.
Broadcasters are reluctant to do it because it's more expensive.
It's also limiting in terms of their finances, right? Because they want these shows to keep on going. And there's that sort of almost industrial complex that is you want the show to run as long as it possibly can in success.
Yeah. But I think, the end of it is like, if a story is a question followed by an answer, then an answer is finite. And so at that point, you can go no further. So the question you always ask, and I always used to ask as a commissioner, okay, well, what's season 7? What are you going to do then? And so you build that into the commissioning as well. And there are ways of solving it. Like, we'll kill the protagonist and replace them. Spooks.
That's a new story, you mean? Almost create a new story, yeah.
Yeah, either you change the characters or you do. That great invention, which American Horror Story sort of pioneered of
the anthology
seasons. So season anthologies. You find new ways of processing it, but I think you need to know what you're going to do at the beginning, even if you never get to it.
Sure.
So there is a good test that I always used to use, which is if you've done a limited series like Big Little Lies, for example, and it's huge. And then the network will automatically reverse an articulated lorry full of cash up to your door and say it's all yours if you do season 2. I think the test you should ask as a writer is, will the ending of season 1 work as a midpoint for a 2-season show? And if the answer is yes, then do that. But if the answer is no, you should send that lorry, which is easier said than done.
Or maybe use that money for a new show and just trust the creators behind that first show to create something different.
Exactly that. And I think there is this. There is that fear of oh my God, we're going to keep it going. But often as not, it's always disappointing because there's no there was no plan for it. The question's already been answered, so it's based on a fake premise.
Yes, yeah. I mean, what are the shows and movies out there right now that you think of successfully implementing this kind of 5-act structure, or that you see this symmetry? And are there any recent movies and things that you sort of say, wow, look, they did that fantastically?
Well, I don't know how many of them are doing it consciously.
No, sure.
But I think the 5-act model is really not dissimilar to the American terrestrial network model that ran for years.
Of the 1-hour drama, yeah,
because there's 4 ad breaks. So the shows that did it brilliantly were the West Wing, ER. You saw really clear, sense of story structure. Now, I think you see it. What have I seen things that I keep going back to and think are perfectly structured. The Queen's Gambit is close to perfect.
Yes.
It was a remarkable piece of filmmaking and writing. Before that, Chernobyl. I mean, Craig Mazin is brilliant. But I think a lot of The Last of Us is fantastic as well. Whether he can keep that going with an ending in sight is going to be a really fascinating question. But I'm intrigued by the changes he's making, and obviously he's following the game to an extent there. But even in more commercial fare, I mean, you will look at. I mean, Taylor Sheridan is a really important writer in terms of television drama, and some of it is quite hokey and soapy, but he's just got an innate sense of story structure that is lovely, and works. And you see, if you watch all of Yellowstone, after a while you'll go, oh, it falls prey to all the things that soap in the UK, as we call it, falls to, which is that they've done that, they would never do that, I wouldn't believe that, I've seen that, but you've forgotten about that story. And what carries it is character.
It's longing run enough to forget about these incidents happening previously.
Yeah, so you rely on the thing I used to rely on EastEnders, which is audience and character amnesia, which is, characters would get shot and then 3 weeks later they've forgotten ever that happened. The things that had happened to you that would normally give you PTSD and you would be a basket case for years.
By necessity. Appreciate that. Well, let's ask some more practical application questions. Because you're working with lots of writers now through John Yorke's story, and when you're working with writers who are stuck, which is the structural element you find is most commonly the culprit?
Passive protagonist is actually the one you keep coming back to. Yeah, and that or getting lost in the middle. Basically, the way. And I got a lot of this from America, actually. Years ago, I went to spend a few weeks on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I sat in the writer's room, which was an amazing experience. And, then I saw how American showrunning works, and it's all about you find the break. You're breaking the episode. You find the hooks for the episode. So you look for the commercial breaks, and you pin those down first, and then you put the scenes in between, that's a really smart way of structuring an episode.
No, it makes sense to find the midpoint first, find the end of Act 1, find the end of Act 10 of things.
Because once you've got those tent poles, it's just easier to build. It's like physics. I think if you look at a lot of great British writers, they do the exact. Chris Chibnall will do it with 4 acts, but he'll use, it's fundamentally the same thing. Jed Mercurio, he'll write in 10-minute chunks. He refuses to call them acts in the same way. But if you look at what turned Jed from a cult writer into a superstar and arguably the most successful writer in Britain, is every 10 minutes, huge reversal every 10 minutes, massive subversion expectation, kill the hero. It's that, and it just pumps the audience full of drugs, basically.
Yeah.
You're like that the whole time. And they're massive. I mean, literally no one has done what Jed did in terms of creating an extraordinary commercial monster in the UK. But it all goes back to sort of act breaks. And once you understand that structure is your friend and not an enemy to be fought.
Curious, because you've obviously worked with lots of emerging writers through the website and the workshops, but I'm curious what you find are maybe the structural mistakes that are found in professional scripts. That's interesting, and it's slightly harder to talk about because you don't want to offend anybody. But I do get angry with shows where the around season 3 just go off the boil, and I kind of go, well, you haven't thought this through, and I don't think there's any need for that. Except sometimes you're under terrible time pressure. The other thing, still too much is carrying story in dialogue, as opposed to carrying it in pictures. Which is a remnant of theatrical tradition, and that sort of slightly annoys me. I think, and the other one sometimes is just, I don't need to know that about a character. Stop telling me stuff about the character. That old Walter Hill rule, which was don't tell me any backstory. The writer probably needs to know it, but the audience probably don't. And I think it was Walter Hill
Might have been someone else, but could have been. It was David Mamet, actually. David Mamet said, the less you tell me about a character, the more easily it is for me to empathize with them. Because you're not giving me information that distances them from me.
That separates them from my own experience. Right, yeah. Yeah.
The platonic ideal of story, which I think you're always going through, is a character pursuing a goal that an audience identifies with through ever-increasing obstacles that become increasingly impossible to get round, but somehow manage to do it in an exciting yet plausible manner. And it is that pursuit, a body in motion through time and space, is what drama is. And dialogue tends to mitigate against that. It can be brilliant, but it's not essential. But I mean, I'm slightly obsessive, as you can probably tell. But I watch a lot of silent films because they're brilliant and all the lessons are there, and they had to do it without dialogue.
Showing, not telling. Yeah.
And the best of them are just extraordinary. And all the lessons are there.
Well, I obviously want to sing the praises of the book, which I still think is one of the sort of main texts I return to.
Oh, bless you. Thank you.
But please, I'd love to give you an opportunity to talk about John Yorke's story and how people can find you.
This sort of evolved out of the book, really, as I started getting people writing to me and saying, can you come and talk to us or consult on projects or whatever. So we set up a company called John Yorke Story, which offers kind of story consultancy, problem fixing, but also training, whether it's in-house for big corporations or film studios, or for young writers as well.
It's also selling companies on their own sort of corporate story as well. Like it applies across the board.
The rules are the same wherever you go, which is, who wins is the one with the best story. So it's true in politics, clearly, as well. Because whatever you may feel about him, Donald Trump is a very good storyteller, and so you can see how that moves a lot of people in the right direction. And so, we sort of go and help people out on those things. We do young writers as well. We do online. There's quite a lot of online courses because it sort of goes around the world. But also we do a lot of in-person stuff as well, and increasingly in America.
There's workshops, actually live workshops over here and things.
Yeah. I'm actually coming over in the autumn to LA. And a colleague of mine is doing something in Rhode Island. So it's interesting because when I wrote Into the Woods, we offered it to American publishers, and the big three all said, "Well, we've got our story guru. We don't need another one." And so it came out on Overlook Press, who were lovely and fantastically helpful. But it meant that the book wasn't as well known for a long time because they just didn't have the heft. Really lovely and immensely flattering is over the years, word of mouth has sort of,
transitioned. So
it's sort of become a thing, which is immensely flattering and beyond my wildest dreams.
I think it's necessary. I think it's one of the only books that does, as you said, go into the why behind it, and with the scientific clarity that I appreciated.
Well, thank you. That means a lot.
But I hope more people seek it out over here. But John, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your stories and your ideas of story.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. I mean, as you can see, I love talking about it, and I have to be dragged away from the microphone because I just find it so fascinating that the human brain can do that. So it's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, John.